the pregnancies are aborted for what you can call non-frivolous reason, okay, meaning health of the mother or the fetus is deformed and kind of scenarios like that, okay, where there is a good scientific justification why you may want to abort this pregnancy because you want to save the life of one or the other, and even more importantly, you don't want to give birth to a child which is having known genetic deformities and then make life miserable for the child as well as for the parents, because sometimes it's easy for all of us to be judgmental, but what if we had a child who is suffering from very severe form of autism, for example, or down syndrome, for example. So those children have it rough, okay, so they may not be fully self-aware of everything they are going through, but they have it rough, but their parents would find it extremely difficult to cope up with their children for the rest of their lives. And some of the times, if these children were to live for, let's say, 20 years, 25 years and die, then it also scars the parents for a long time to come. So of all the abortions carried out in the US, 7 to 13% of the abortions are for legitimate reasons or for non-frivolous reasons. The remaining 87 to 93% of the abortions are carried out for absolutely frivolous reasons, like, hey, I got pregnant, but then I don't think I'm ready for the relationship yet, okay, I got pregnant, but then I've got to study too, okay, and then I don't have a job, how am I going to raise the child, okay. All of these questions one should have thought of before getting pregnant or even before having sex with somebody. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and then a large number of large number of pregnancies happen because uh, people are irresponsible, they have not used contraceptives, and in vast majority of the cases, the abortions are carried out for non-frivolous reasons. So this has been a raging debate in the US for the last 50 years or so, ever since Roe v. Wade came. Uh, I'm, like I said, I'm not a lawyer. I don't care about the legal aspects of it, but there is one aspect of Roe v. Wade which is very pertinent to the discussion I want to have. Right, number one is the viability argument. Roe v. Wade legitimized abortion on the grounds of viability. What does viability mean? Viability means, can the fetus survive ex utero? Meaning, if you were to take the fetus out of the womb, can the fetus survive? And they came up with a number. I think the cutoff line is something like 23 weeks or something. So, meaning before the 23rd week of pregnancy, the fetus has very low likelihood of surviving outside the uterus. So it was deemed an unviable fetus, and then aborting that fetus was considered all right. Okay, that's what the earlier judgment from Supreme Court pretty much legitimized. So now, to me, this entire argument is an extremely expedient and also an argument that is not bound by any moral scruples. And I'll explain that a little bit. Okay, I'm not a fan of Samuel Alito, one of the Supreme Court judges, but then he did make a very good argument in this. He said the fetus has an interest in having a life, and that does not change between before and after viability. Okay, so meaning, let's say 23rd week is deemed as the cutoff line for viability. A day before or a day after, nothing changes for the fetus. The fetus still wants to, has an interest in living, has an interest in surviving. And that's a good point he makes. And that actually highlights how arbitrary the entire viability argument has been. And it's also a very fallacious argument, because when you look at the viability argument, what you're saying is you take the fetus out of the uterus and can it survive? But the question is, why would you take the fetus out of the uterus? A fetus belongs in the womb. A mother nurtures the fetus inside the womb for 9 months and then brings the child out. And it doesn't stop there, because a newborn, in not only human beings, but in all primates, requires a long period of gestation. Then it requires a long period of care. There's a long infancy, then there is an adolescence, and then it becomes an adult. So in other words, both in humans and all the other primates, you have to care for several years for the infant before the infant can survive on his or her own. An infant becomes an adult and can survive on his or her own in this world. So take a simple example. You can take a newborn child, let's say a 3-month-old child, and you can leave the child in the forest, in the jungle, or you can leave the child in the highway. Will the child survive? It won't. Then one can always apply the viability argument and say, a child that's a newborn child, a 3-month-old child, is not viable because he or she cannot survive on his own. Because what you have done is you have taken the child out of the comforts of the home of the mother and father, where the child belongs, and you have left the child in the highway or in a forest, and then you are arbitrarily arguing for the viability of the child. And this is another very important point the bioethicist Peter Singer of Princeton makes. He made this argument part rhetorically and part factually. He made an important point that a newborn child for several months does not have awareness that is independent of the mother, meaning the child does not perceive himself or herself to be independent of the mother. Okay. In other words, for a few months, the child lacks self-awareness. That's the argument he makes, which is a good biological argument. And then in that case, then he asks a rhetorical question. So then why can't you kill a child? Because the child is not self-aware. Okay. A newborn child can be killed. So once again, if you're going to use self-awareness for viability, then we can definitely go and kill the child, but then we know that's something wrong with it. So then what's the right way of deciding whether a child is viable or not? I would say, simply put, in the distant past, okay, maybe a century ago, about a third of the pregnancies miscarried in the first trimester of pregnancy. But after that, the medical science has improved. Today, that percentage is significantly less. And we can be almost certain that most of the pregnancies, from the once it gets past the first trimester, it will end up in the birth of a healthy child. But even in the first trimester, as medical technology advances, the natural miscarriages will decline in number. So what we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence is that a child in the womb is viable because once the child is nurtured for 9 months inside the womb, and then the child is born, the child is going to survive. Okay, so then it brings up the important question: when do we treat the child as a person? Is it right at the moment of conception? That's what most of the Christian conservatives in the US would argue. They would argue as soon as the sperm and the ovum have fused together, that life is conceived, so life at conception. Okay, so from that point onwards, no abortion. This to me is a religious faith. Okay, this is a religious belief. This is a dogma. We do not know the answer because what is life is extremely complex. We know there are a few things that are very central to what we call life. One is consciousness. Second is being self-aware. Okay, third one is responding to stimuli and all these things. But out of those, the one that matters most, in my opinion, is consciousness. Okay, consciousness is a very hard problem to solve and to understand. There are multiple trajectories that are happening. One is a trajectory within neuroscience, where the general premise is consciousness is an emergent property in our brain. It's a brain function, and hence it can be measured and it can be detected. It's a hypothesis, not yet fully proven. And then at the other end of the spectrum is that there is something called quantum consciousness. This is what Penrose, Hameroff, and others have put forth. There is something called quantum consciousness, and then there are microtubules in our brain that resonate at a certain frequency. They act like antenna, and then they can now, like an antenna, an antenna can receive the waves. They can now connect with the universal consciousness, and then through what is called as orchestrated OR, can reduce that to a state within the brain where we can perceive that as a temporal reality. But none of this solves for the hard problem. Okay, the distinction, this is something Sam Harris talks about in his book Waking Up, the distinction between the cognizer and then the cognized is a very hard problem to solve. We do not know. Okay, when, for example, when the neural net in your brain is sending all the signals, who is the conscious entity that is perceiving those? We don't know the answer. Okay, but consciousness is what really sets us apart. Okay, that's what makes us human. At what stage does consciousness develop in the fetus, in the womb? We do not know the answer. Okay, there have been some speculations, because since consciousness is not fully understood, we cannot exactly say when it happens. But in Hinduism and Buddhism, Consciousness is often closely associated with the pineal gland. Okay, so we have the chakra system. I'm not going into those discussions, but it is closely associated with the pineal gland, and the pineal gland becomes detectable uh, in in uh, in the laboratory from the 49th day of conception. And very interestingly, in Tibetan Buddhism, in the Tibetan Book of Dead, that's when the life enters the womb. It's on the 49th day. Okay. So once again, this I would consider it as a belief, as a faith, and not something necessarily a proof. Okay. But what it does tell you is that consciousness is what sets us apart as human beings. That's what sets us apart as living entities. Okay. A conscious fetus is what we can say is having life. Okay. But one thing we know for sure, we do not know whether the consciousness manifests on day 1 of conception or day 49 of conception or day 100 of conception. We do not know the answer. But we know one answer for sure. If the pregnancy is not interrupted, if the fetus is not aborted, then the consciousness will develop in the fetus. It becomes detectable in our instruments. Then the child is born as a full blown child at the end of the pregnancy. And the viability argument is extremely expedient and arbitrary, and one without any moral scruples, because it's an extremely artificial argument. Why would you take the fetus out of the uterus and test its viability when the fetus actually belongs in the uterus? By the same yardstick, we can also take the heart out of somebody and argue it cannot, since the heart cannot beat outside of the body, then the viability argument applies here. Or a lot of people, our own parents, our own grandparents, and some of them may have grown old and become paralyzed or something, or having Alzheimer's or dementia, and they may not even have cognition the way we all have. And then we can bring up the viability argument for them and kill them. We don't do that because most of the times these are the people we have seen, these are the people we have interacted with, and hence we know that there are memories. And even for a child, there are those memories, but those memories are going to happen in the future. Since it's a child inside the womb, we do not see the child, and a very artificial worldview is being projected through the viability argument to justify abortions. And why is that? Most of the women uh, do not revolt against this, because after all, when a woman gets pregnant, she undergoes hormonal changes. Then she also uh, develops a deep bond with the child that's forming inside. Then why is she not revolting against it? The answer for that is 1 in 4 American women would have an abortion before she turns 45. Since it's a large number of people, they have a compulsion to justify their choices and their actions, and because of that, a large number of Americans end up supporting abortion. So now coming to the Hindu perspective, the title is a Hindu perspective, not the Hindu perspective. Okay, because there is no one single Hindu perspective. Hinduism, the Hindu society, like every other ancient society, considered life to be sacred. Okay, and in traditional Hinduism, abortion was considered as one of the Mahapatakas. Okay, one of the grave sins from which there is no redemption, and there's a reason for that. Okay, for the most part, people got married early. A girl would have got married in her teens, and by the time she was 17 or 18, she would have had a child. So most of them got married early, and then they had a child. And then two, what we call career. Okay, having an academic career or a work career is a very recent phenomenon, right? It's only in the last 100 years we are working for corporations, and we see family life as something coming in the way of our career progression. This is a very recent phenomenon, okay, in the last 100 years. And in third world countries, it's a phenomenon that goes back only the last 20 or 30 years. In the pre-modern world, people were not having a career, and for them, their family was the center of their existence. They worked only as much as they had to earn to keep the family well fed, protected, treated, and all these things. So a child was not seen as an obstacle. It was not seen as something of an impediment to your career growth, and there was no compulsion to abort the fetus. That was the first reason. And second reason, there was a concept of, in Hinduism, there was a concept of sacred, because you did not become pregnant just by accident. Okay, you got married. Okay, and then your marriage was a sacrament. It's called samskara, and then your pregnancy is called it's called garbhadana samskara, and then it's a sacrament, and it was considered something of a very sacred. The union between a man and woman was considered as something sacred, and then the pregnancy was a result of the sacred union, and hence it had to be nourished. Okay, so this was the second concept, and then uh, the third one is, mm, did it change at any point in time in Hinduism? So you are not going to find too many of those references. However, we do find one from the 9th or 10th century. Okay, it's in the form of a book called Devala Smriti. So there was a Rishi Devala. Okay, he lived in the Sindh province. He lived around the 9th or the 10th century when a lot of Islamic invasions happened in that part of the country. Okay, Sindh is in Pakistan today. So there was a lot of widespread rape. There was a lot of butchering, and a lot of women were taken as captives, and many of them were raped, and many of them became pregnant, etc. And Devala Rishi deals with this reality. Okay, he does not openly endorse abortions. However, what he talks about is he comes up with a lot of prescriptions for how a woman who has been taken away and who has been raped, etc., how she can be integrated back with her husband and with her family. And one of the things he talks about is, if a woman had been taken away and if she had been raped, and but if she has her next menses cycle, and then if she has undergone some of the sacrificial rites, then she is purified and then she becomes part of the family. That's, I think, a brilliant observation, because uh, the psychological trauma that results from rape is terrible, and that's true today. That would have been as much true 1,000 years ago, when Rishi Devala wrote these prescriptions. And for him to come up with these prescriptions would have convinced the husband and woman that now they have become, that the woman has become purified now, and then the husband and wife can now rebuild their sacred relationships. It was beautiful. And he does not openly endorse abortion. However, he kind of implicitly supports it under some cases, where he says, if uh, a woman had been raped, but then if the next menses happens, he leaves it open, right? Whether there was a pregnancy in between, and then that was aborted. He doesn't talk about that, but that's kind of implied, at least in my reading. Then in those cases, uh, he supports it. So the takeout I have is that under extraordinary circumstances, Hinduism does support abortions. Okay, what those circumstances are is not spelled out, but that's the fundamental challenge we'll always have with any objective morality setting. Okay, contrasted with an absolute morality setting. Okay, what's the difference between the two? An absolute morality is what Christians follow in the United States, or what Muslims follow. For them, the Bible says, or the Quran says, and hence it is correct. They don't question that. They cannot challenge that. Whereas objective morality is where we can objectively arrive at a conclusion whether some action is moral or not. And this is based on reasons. This is based on uh, uh, different instruments of knowledge that we can use. And in the rich Hindu tradition, we can arrive at it. So that's where I think a Hindu perspective becomes very important, because Hindu perspective requires the use of pramana. Pramana is a Sanskrit word for instruments of knowledge. We can use all of these things, and we can say, under what circumstances can we make an exception to abortion? In my reading, that's what Devala Rishi does. He did it about 1,000 years ago, because rape and abduction of women was unknown to Hindus until the Islamic invasions happened, and he is now dealing with it. But a much bigger perspective is, why at all is this happening in the US today? It's because uh, sex, or a relationship between a man and a woman, is no longer considered sacred. It's considered as something very ephemeral. It's something treated as, it's an impulse, and you just respond to that, and that's it. And then people, uh, this is what amazes me all the time, right? You want to buy, let's say, an iPhone, right? And then the iPhone you are going to buy, it may cost you like, $800, $1,000, right? So, and then you do a lot of research. You don't go and spend these $1,000 right away. You do a lot of research. You go on the social media, you discuss with everyone. You probably visit the store a couple of times. You test out every other feature, then you buy. And this is for an iPhone that will probably get replaced in 2 or 3 years from now. But when it comes to uh, relationships, we don't think of those things as important. Okay, we don't even invest the kind of time we invest in buying an iPhone. Okay, that's a very fundamental problem with the Western civilization today, and in particularly with the American civilization, because we are talking about an American context here. And most of these folks, what they do, they get into a relationship primarily out of peer pressure, because once you're in your teenage, you have to have you have to go on date, and then you have to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and then you have to have sex and all these things. There's a lot of peer pressure, and most yield to that. And most of these people are not uh, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually prepared to deal with these things, because they don't have a notion of sacred relationships, and then they don't have a psychological maturity to understand the consequences of their action, and they get into that. And when they do that, a good number of them find themselves to be pregnant, and then they realize, oh my God, this is not the person with whom I can even spend a week together, but how can I raise a child with this person? I think that's the fundamental problem with the United States. So while the rest of the US is consumed with Roe v. Wade, with the viability argument, whether it is 23 weeks, whether it's 15 weeks, whether it is 12 weeks, whether it is 8 weeks, to me, those are all extremely secondary. Okay. All of those are still scratching at the surface. Coming from the Hindu perspective, what is really missing in the US is a fundamental notion of life as sacred, okay, relationships as sacred, and that's where I think the Hindu perspective is very important. We consider both of these things to be sacred, and everything becomes a samskara. Your garbhadana becomes a samskara, and then your vivaha is a samskara. But Hinduism, this is something your dharma shastras always talk about all the time. If something does not increase happiness, if something does not increase harmony, then it can be revised. That's why we don't have a single dharma shastra, we have multiple dharma shastras. And that's what we find in the example of Devala Rishi, who writes a Smriti when the Islamic invasions happen in the Sindh. And then he comes up with some prescriptions which are not explicit, but which implicitly support abortions under certain conditions. So, what should be the Hindu perspective? The Hindu perspective is, it starts with recognizing there are three entities in play here. One is the mother, the other is the father. The two of them should have had a sacred relationship, and the two of them should have had a trusting relationship before they decided to get a child, and then they should intend to stay together for the rest of their lives. I'm not saying it will happen all the time. Okay, we are living in a complex world, and sometimes people may go through a divorce. But when you start, you should have a notion of living together for the rest of your life. And if it doesn't happen, then you are not going to treat this as a sacred relationship. This is number one. Then the second one is, there is a child involved. Okay, the fetus, if not interrupted, and if the pregnancy is not terminated, regardless of when consciousness develops, on day 1, day 49, day 100, I do not know. Science doesn't know the answer. Regardless of when it develops, if the pregnancy is nurtured, will be born as a healthy human being at the end of the pregnancy. And hence, the right of the child should be paramount. Okay, why should the child be treated as a non-entity? And this is a fundamental flaw with the feminist argument. They treat the child as an extended body part. It is not. Okay, the fetus is temporarily hosted by the mother for a period of 9 months, and she is only a safekeeper. And then the child comes out, born, and then the child is raised. So, for example, we don't encourage pregnant women to consume alcohol or smoke cigarette, and there are enough medical warnings against that. I do not know what the legality if a woman does these things, but then there are enough medical warnings because it impacts the child. We don't bring up this argument, oh, wait a minute, the child doesn't have consciousness. We don't bring up the viability argument to say that you can go and drink as much as you want, you can smoke cigarettes as much as you want, because we do care for the right of the child to be nurtured and brought out as a healthy human being. That's why we have those Surgeon General's warning in your alcohol bottles and in your cigarette pack. And strangely, that uh, logic is abandoned when the viability argument is muted. is put forth. Okay, so the right thing to do is to think of the child as a viable entity from the very beginning. Okay, and then abortion has to be allowed under extraordinary conditions, because that's where I'll go back to the premise of Dharma Shastra. Dharma is that which uh, increases the collective happiness of everyone in society. So what happens if a woman had been raped, especially a teenage girl had been raped, and should she be forced to go through with an abortion? I don't think so. Okay, that's my personal belief, because that's not something the child opted for. It's not a product of sacred union, and hence, uh, it's important to um, make an exception in this case. And there are other cases where you can make an exception. What if the fetus is having severe abnormalities that will make its life miserable and that of the parents miserable? I think those are some examples. Okay, there could be others. And I think the bottom line is objective morality is determined through reasonable argumentation and not by appealing to dogma. The viability argument, as well as the argument that a woman gets to decide, those are all dogmatic arguments. Same with the Christian argument that conception, the life starts at conception, is again a dogmatic argument. The Hindu perspective is a little different. The Hindu perspective recognize, recognizes the sanctity of life, but following the framework of Dharma Shastras, which say that a practice can be abandoned or revised when it is not promoting the collective happiness of everyone and the harmony of everyone, then we can go back and make an exception. And that's what, in my reading, Devala Rishi has made, and that's what I think we can continue to make. But then it has to be an exceptional decision, a decision that involves all the three parties: the mother, the father, and then the to be born child or the unborn child, and with enough regulations in place. I'll pause and I'm open to any questions. Rajiv, back to you.
Yeah, you can. If anybody has questions, they can unmute themselves now.
Hi, I have one question to ask you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So, we are now living in the Western hemisphere, right? So our kids are growing up here from the, different ages. So how do we, as a Hindu society, can pass on this information, the one which you shared, uh, in a more easy to understandable way for especially the girl childs?
It's a really good question. I like this question because I think it's not only in the Western Hemisphere, right? And I think the paradigm thoughts from the West are also spreading to India and to the rest of the world, right? So even a child growing up in Delhi or Bangalore would have a similar thought process as a child growing up in Boston or San Francisco. So the question is, how do we educate the next generation? I think what has happened is we have vacated the space, right? There is a concept called dharmic learning where we teach the children about all these things from childhood. We don't do that. Okay, we don't make it interesting, at least. Okay, so as a result of that, a lot of our children grow up in the West or even in India without any grounding at all. Okay, in the dharmic perspective of life. That's number one. Then number two, with the left feminist and the woke movements in the West, these are totalitarian movements, right? And then they go ahead and then they take over the entire media, the entire social media, the academy, everything. And then the narratives they put out are the narratives uh, that they agree with. Okay, and then they don't allow any other alternative. Okay, and then so somebody argues, why is that? If somebody were to say, look, the fetus is not an extended body part of the woman, then immediately they'll scream, you're a misogynist. Okay, so most people fear being called a misogynist or a racist or any one of these things, and then they stop discussing this. I think is a very dangerous trend. So for example, John McWhorter, he's a professor at Columbia, and he has recently published a book called Woke Racism. He's a black person. Okay, and then he has published a book called Woke Racism, where he talks about some of these concepts, why it is dangerous, right? Because they impose a certain worldview, and if you don't agree with that, then you are a racist, okay? Or in our context, you are a misogynist, okay? And then, or you're patriarchal, whatever, right? All those terms are bandied out, and then people fear those things, okay? That's the danger, okay? And I think at some stage we have to start bringing up an alternative discourse, okay? Not dogmatically, but without fearing this kind of branding. And then we should start talking about, look, or we are American Nazis today, and do we want to remain that way? Okay, and then bring up the question around consciousness, and then finally wrap it up with how we do it with, what is the dharmic stance on it. Now to your question, how do we do that, right? So I think every one of us has to put in some thought. I don't think I have a ready prescription for, look, here is the narrative that will resonate well with them. I think most of us will have to start making the effort from the time the children are very young, okay, and start teaching, but keep an open mind, right? Allow for scientific arguments to permeate, and number two, allow for reasonable discourses to happen. Don't take dogmatic stances, okay? That way you'll be able to highlight what the extremes are, okay? And then the kids will by default not embrace those extremes, right? And then the most salient features of the argument, that look, there is a third party involved here, which the viability argument does not even recognize. That is the unborn child. Bring up that argument. I think eventually my hope is that human beings do have empathy, and if the arguments are correctly placed, those arguments will resonate with them.
Thank you. A follow-up question. 84 million lives, which our philosophy believes, right? Like that after 84 million, you come back in a circle, right? So this is the circle of life after death. So how does this what fits into that area, if there is any?
I'm still undecided about reincarnation, right? Because reincarnation is a very interesting idea, in my opinion. Okay, so that because I think it explains the law of karma well, right? So every action has a consequence, but why is a child born with certain deformities? That's because the karmic reaction from a previous birth. Okay, so from that philosophical premise, I like reincarnation as an idea. Okay, and I've also seen some of the researches by what's Ian Stevenson and others, right, and from University of Virginia, that do lend credence to the idea that people do get reincarnated. Okay, now I don't think he made up any of those evidences. Okay, I think he was very rigorous in summarizing those things. But I have not personally examined those case studies that he has summarized, so I do not know. I'm very open to that idea, but from an empirical scientific perspective, I'm not, by which I do not mean empirical science is the end of everything. Okay, it does not explain everything, but then it explains your temporal existence. From an empirical perspective, is there evidence for reincarnation? There's none. So I'm open about that. I would like to keep my mind, ears and eyes open to the notion of reincarnation. But right now, I don't have a position on that. So I do not know whether I want to formulate a stance on, something like, abortion based on reincarnation.
Dhanyawad, sir.
You're welcome. Right. If no other question, then my pleasure.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Sir, this is Venkat Narayana.
Yeah.
Good morning, sir. I'm sorry I joined a little late, but I'm not sure if this is covered already. This is related to the previous question. So about law of karma or karma cycle. So most of the 99% of the Indians, Hindus, believe in karma cycle, right? Karma life, law of karma. So how do we treat this abortion as is it going to be adding to their karma?
Oh yeah, that is definitely easy to answer, right? Because a very important thing in Hinduism, and for that reason in Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and all of these religions, is that karmic actions have reactions, right? And then from that perspective, this is considered as one of the Mahapataka in Hinduism. Okay, so from that perspective, there are going to be karmic reactions, and I think that answers that, right? So, so long as somebody is a believing Hindu, I think the answer is very straightforward. Okay, you are going to have very negative karma or vikarma by indulging in this action.
Are there any prayachita for this one?
Not that I'm aware of, but then I discussed a little bit about Devala Smriti, and then my reading, with which others may disagree, is that he implicitly supports abortions under extraordinary situations.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. All right.
Okay.
I think
Anybody
that's
else?
the end of questions. Rajiv, back to you.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Kalabhai. We'll come back with another contemporary topic relating to Hindu existence in America. So until then, just be on a lookout for these announcements and hope to have you next time. Thanks very much.
So,
Namaste and Dhanyavad. Thank you, everyone.
Raju sir, I have a question for you, sir. Quick question.
Okay.
No, this is for more